I have my rights. Are you sure? How do you know you have those rights? When were those rights established? The evolution of liberal ideas goes hand in hand with the codification of individual rights. When we look at democracies versus dictatorships, we'll often look at how well individual rights are protected. So what laws are there to protect your rights? In 1982, Canada passed the Constitution Act, which included the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We had rights before this in documents like the Bill of Rights, but now those rights are entrenched. They can't easily be changed or amended with a piece of legislation. Because it's part of the Constitution, the government must get 7 out of 10 provinces to agree to make that change, which is really hard to do. The United States has a Bill of Rights as well, and it can be amended. You've probably heard of the Second Amendment to establish the right to bear arms. The interpretation of that right is very controversial. There's also the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, and the 19th Amendment, which establishes women's rights. Canada's charter was able to take the ideas in those amendments and make them part of our rights, since many of those U.S. amendments were made decades before we wrote our charter. There's also the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This liberal document encourages nations around the world to respect individual rights. But did you notice I said encourages? The problem with this document is that it's very difficult to enforce. If a nation is violating the rights in the Universal Declaration, we could talk to them, we can even put sanctions against them. But what more are we willing to do? Would we want to go to war and kill people to force a country to honor the rights of their people? So why do we need human rights? Human rights are those rights granted to all people, regardless of nationality. It includes fundamental freedoms like freedom of expression and association. We also speak of civil rights, like in the case of the civil rights movement. Civil rights are granted to citizens of a state by their government. They include the right to participate in a democracy. So when we speak of Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, what they were fighting for in the civil rights movement was the right to be treated equally under the law, which is a human right, and to have those rights applied to participation in events like elections, which is a civil right. Do you remember the big 3 philosophers we keep focusing on throughout the year, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau? Do you remember their opinions regarding human rights and the role of government? Hobbes, you give up individual rights in return for security. Locke, individual rights, especially for property, is essential, but you might have to give up some for security. And Rousseau felt that group rights should be decided by individuals participating within the group, but then the group would enforce all of the rules. We saw the influence of those philosophical ideas during the French and American revolutions. The French created the Declaration of the Rights of Man, really the forebearer of all rights legislation in liberal societies around the world, like our charter. Even the U.S. Declaration of Independence demonstrates a respect for individual rights when it states all men are created equal and have unalienable rights. So let's look at a few areas where rights legislation has evolved. The protection of workers has taken a long road, as many classical liberal societies opposed government intervention in the economy. It took modern liberal reformers decades to convince governments to end the practices such as ending the slave trade. Before that, some of the earliest modern liberal actions taken by government included legislation to protect the worst abuses of workers. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, workers were being abused in the pursuit of profit, so liberal governments passed laws setting hours of work, which early on was 12 hours a day instead of our 8. There was also rules for safe working conditions so that the human worker became more valuable than the machine. Child labor laws, eventually even minimum wage. John Stuart Mill agreed that there needed to be some intervention in order to protect the workers. For instance, he supported the creation of labor unions to provide workers with the ability to negotiate with their employers. Although he's an individualist, he also believed everyone needed a chance to compete. This also relates to his support of women's rights. Mill didn't live to see women gaining equality with men, as that's a process that's still going on today. While Canada provided women the right to vote almost a century ago, and then had the courts rule that women were in fact persons a decade later, women still don't have the same level of power or income that men have. This is due to a variety of factors, including the continued emphasis on women taking care of the children, which of course then impacts their earning power. One way some governments have tried to address this inequality in the workplace is to enact affirmative action programs. These programs were created to provide opportunities for minority groups to compete in the workplace. Many minority groups have not had the same opportunities to access a quality education. In the 1960s and 70s, many employers weren't conscious of the fact that they preferred white male employees for positions of authority. So the government and major corporations decided to set quotas that would demand that a member of a minority group must be considered first. The intent was to integrate more minorities into working environments so those prejudices would disappear, to create a society where everyone has the equal opportunity to compete. Unfortunately, there were some negative consequences. Some people began to assume that when a member of a minority group was given a promotion, it was due to affirmative action, and not because that person was best suited for the job. In addition, white men began to complain that reverse discrimination was occurring, as they were being told that they shouldn't apply for certain government jobs. So you can see that while the establishment of individual rights is essential to a liberal society, how we do that is not easily explained.